The boardroom on the 32nd floor had never been louder. 7 board members, 3 senior partners, 2 corporate lawyers, all of them arguing over a vote that was now less than 40 minutes away. Documents were flying across the table, voices were sharp and cutting, and at the center of it all stood a man named Rice, calm, quiet, and certain that he had already won. No one in that room had any idea that they were wrong, because 6 floors below them, in a narrow maintenance corridor next to a pair of worn work gloves, sat a small, cracked leather diary. It had not been opened in 11 years. The man who wrote it had been dead for 3. And the decision being made upstairs, the one Rice had spent 4 months engineering, would have broken that man's heart. The person who found the diary that morning was not a lawyer. He was not a board member or a partner or an executive with a corner office. He was a maintenance worker named Anthony Zamora, an immigrant, a widowed father, a man who rode the service elevator every morning while everyone else took the one with mirrors. He found it beneath a lobby bench during his rounds. He picked it up the way he picked up everything the building dropped, and no one noticed. Quietly, without a second thought. He had no idea whose initials were pressed into the cover. He had no idea what was drawn on the second page, and he had absolutely no idea that by the time the sun went down that night, everything, for him, for the firm, and for a daughter who didn't yet know what her father was truly capable of, was about to change forever. Anthony Zamora was always awake before the sun decided to bother. By 5:15, the small kitchen of their apartment was already warm, a pot of oatmeal on the stove, a lunchbox open on the counter. He moved carefully in the half-dark, the way a man moves when he has learned not to wake the only person left in the world he is living for. He sliced an apple into careful wedges, wrapped them in a paper towel, and tucked them beside a small sandwich he had made the night before. Then he did the thing he had done every single morning for 3 years without missing once. He took a pen from the kitchen drawer, tore a small square from a paper bag, and drew something on it. A tiny bird this time. Wings up, mid-flight. He folded it once and set it on top of the apple slices before closing the lunchbox. Maria would find it at noon. She would smile the way her mother used to smile, with her whole face and slightly too wide. And Anthony would not be there to see it. He almost never was. But he drew the picture anyway. He kissed her forehead without waking her, pulled the door shut behind him, and walked out into the gray of early morning. The building where Anthony worked was the kind that made you feel small just by looking at it. 40 stories of glass and steel rising out of the city like something that had decided gravity was optional. Roberts and Lamb architecture had occupied its top 12 floors for over 2 decades. The lobby alone was the size of some people's entire neighborhoods. Marble floors, high ceilings, a fountain near the entrance that no one ever looked at. Important people passed through it every day without slowing down. And Anthony slowed down. He always did, not because he was not busy, but because the building spoke to him in a language that most people never learned. He noticed things. The way a certain floor tile near the east entrance had started to lift at the corner. A sign of moisture underneath, a problem that would get worse before any one official admitted it existed. The way the main entrance doors stuck slightly in cold weather, putting extra stress on the top hinge. Small things. The kind of things a person noticed only if they understood how buildings worked from the inside out. That morning, as he crossed the lobby toward the maintenance corridor, he stopped in front of the far-left column near the security desk. He had been watching it for 6 weeks, a hairline fracture barely visible running diagonally from the base. As he crouched down and looked at it the way a doctor looks at something that worries them, his eyes moved upward along the column, calculating silently. Load-bearing, corner position. The fracture was not critical yet, but it would be. He stood up, looked around. A security guard was scrolling on his phone. 2 assistants were rushing past with coffee cups. No one was looking at the column. No one was looking at Anthony. He took out his notepad and wrote it down. The date, the location, the length of the crack. He had written it down 4 times before. He had slipped the notes under the door of the facilities manager's office. Nothing had happened. He supposed he would write it down again. This was the shape of Anthony's life inside that building. He saw everything. He was seen by no one. It had not always been this way. There was a time, not so long ago, though it felt like a different lifetime now, when Anthony Zamora was the kind of young man that professors remembered. In his home country, he had studied architecture with the kind of focus that crowds out everything else. He sketched in the margins of every notebook. He stayed late in the university's drafting room long after the other students had gone home, drawing buildings that existed only in his mind but felt as real to him as anything he had ever touched. At 23, he entered a regional design competition and won. His professor shook his hand and told him he had a rare kind of intelligence, the kind that understood not just how a structure stood, but why it mattered to the people inside it. He arrived in this country with that prize on his resume and a rolled-up portfolio under his arm. He was ready. He believed that was enough. It was not enough. The credentialing board reviewed his degree and found it ineligible for recognition. The licensing office sent him a letter with a list of additional requirements that would take years and money he did not have. Firms he approached were polite and brief. His portfolio was impressive, they said. Unfortunately, he heard that word so many times it started to feel like his name. Unfortunately. His wife was alive then. She held his hand on the nights when the rejections came and told him they would find another way. They did. He found maintenance work. It paid. It was honest. And little by little, the architect in him went quiet. He still sketched sometimes. Columns, arches, the bones of things. He did it without thinking, the way some people tap their fingers to a song only they can hear. One evening, Maria had come into the kitchen and found him at the table with a pencil and a piece of paper, his hand moving on its own. She climbed onto the chair beside him and looked at what he had drawn. "Did you make that, Papa?" He looked at the sketch. A courtyard, a low roofline, windows positioned to catch the afternoon light. "It's nothing," he said. He turned the paper over. She looked at him for a moment the way children look at adults when they know something is not quite right but do not yet have the words. Then she climbed down and went back to her room. Anthony stared at the blank side of the paper for a long time before he got up and made dinner. That was the kind of man he was on the morning everything changed. Careful, invisible, carrying something he had taught himself not to name. He was making his way through the lobby for his first round of the morning when he saw it. Beneath a wooden bench near the main entrance, half hidden in the shadow of a chair leg, something small and dark. He almost walked past it. He bent down instead, the way he always bent down for things people dropped and left behind, and picked it up. A diary. Small, leather, worn smooth at the corners like something carried for a long time and handled often. The cover was a deep brown, almost black in the morning light, and pressed into the leather near the top right corner in faded gold lettering were 2 letters. S.R. Anthony tucked it under his arm and started toward the front desk. He was halfway there when he stopped. He looked at the initials again, S.R. Something pulled at the edge of his memory. A quiet tug, the kind that meant the answer was there, close, just not yet visible. He had seen those letters before, he was certain of it. But where? He stood in the middle of the lobby, the diary under his arm, the fountain running softly beside him, and for just a moment the noise of the building seemed to fall away. Where had he seen those letters before? The front desk looked like a small war had broken out behind it. 3 phones were ringing at once. A young assistant was balancing a stack of folders with one hand and pressing a headset to her ear with the other. A printer somewhere nearby was making a noise that suggested it had given up entirely. The receptionist, a woman named Alicia, whose nameplate Anthony had read 100 times without ever being introduced to her, was typing with focused urgency and did not look up when he approached. He set the diary gently on the edge of her desk. "Excuse me," he said, someone left this in the lobby near the main entrance. Alicia glanced at it the way a person glances at something that is not their problem. "Lost and found is in the maintenance corridor," she said, already looking back at her screen. "Down the hall, second door on the left." Anthony picked up the diary and turned to go. He had walked this building so many times that his feet knew its turns before his mind gave the instruction. Past the copy room, past the small kitchen that always smelled of burned coffee, around the corner toward the maintenance corridor. He was nearly there when he passed the wall. And it was not a large wall, but the building treated it like one. A row of portraits framed in dark wood mounted at eye level along the stretch between the executive elevator and the conference suite. Important people in important frames captured at the age they most wanted to be remembered. Anthony passed this wall every morning. He never stopped. He stopped now. The third portrait from the left. A man in his 60s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that looked like it had spent a lifetime outdoors thinking through difficult problems. The nameplate beneath the frame was small and simple, understated in the way that people who do not need to announce themselves tend to be. Stephen Roberts, founder, 1951 to 2022, and beneath the name, in smaller letters, and a line from something he had once written, "A building is only as great as the life it makes possible." Sr. Anthony looked down at the diary in his hands. He looked back at the portrait. He looked at the initials pressed into the leather cover. He stood very still for a moment in the quiet of a hallway that no one powerful ever walked through. Then he turned around and walked back to his locker. He told himself he was only going to check, just to confirm. He owed it to the man whose name was on the cover to make sure the diary was returned to the right place, through the right hands. That was all. He sat on the bench inside the maintenance room, turned the diary over once, and opened the cover. The first page stopped him immediately. But the handwriting was precise and architectural. Letters formed with the same deliberateness as a blueprint, each one considered, nothing wasted. Dense notes filled the margins and ran in organized columns down the center of the page. Measurements, observations, a kind of thinking out loud that Anthony recognized because he had done it himself in cheaper notebooks in the years before he decided to stop. He read the first paragraph slowly, then again. He turned to the second page. It was a blueprint, not a copy, not a printout. A hand-drawn original, rendered in ink with a precision that could only come from years of practice. The kind of drawing that a machine could not replicate because it carried in every line the specific intelligence of the person who made it. Anthony's eyes moved across it the way eyes move across something they already know how to read. Column placements, load paths, a structural system of interlocking supports that was elegant in the way that only truly efficient things are elegant. No excess, nothing decorative, everything exactly where it needed to be. He had seen this system before, not like this, not in its original form, but referenced, summarized, reduced to legal language in a filing that had been posted on the building's notice board 2 months ago. A patent dispute, something the firm's lawyers were involved in. Anthony had read it the way he read most things posted in that building. Carefully, completely, and without anyone knowing he had. The patent at the center of the merger vote. That the one that a man named Rice had spent 4 months insisting had no original documentation to support it. Anthony did not know this yet. Not fully. He did not know that Rice had built his entire legal case on the absence of exactly what was sitting open in his lap. He did not know that upstairs, in a boardroom where his name would never be spoken, an argument was being resolved on the basis of something that was not true. He only knew what his hands were telling him, and his hands had carried blueprints before. His hands knew what they were holding. This was not a businessman's diary. This was an architect's. He turned pages slowly, carefully, the way you handle something that belongs to someone who is no longer around to care for it themselves. There were more blueprints, more notes, sketches of buildings that had been built and buildings that never were, observations about cities, about light, about the way people moved through spaces and what that movement told you about whether a building was truly working. Stephen Roberts had thought about buildings the way Anthony thought about buildings, not as products but as promises, structures that owed something to the people who would live and work inside them. Anthony sat in the silence of the maintenance room and read, and for a few minutes he forgot where he was entirely. Then the board meeting began. He did not know that either. 32 floors above him, Rice stood at the head of a long table and opened the morning's proceedings with a single confident statement that no original documentation had been located to dispute the merger's patent claims, and that the vote would proceed as scheduled. Board members nodded, lawyers shuffled papers. The machinery of a very large and consequential decision began to move, and Anthony sat in a maintenance corridor 6 floors below all of it, holding the proof that every word of it was wrong. His radio crackled, his supervisor's voice flat and unhurried. "Zamora, I need you on 32. Executive floor, HVAC panel near the conference suite is jammed again. Now, please. Anthony closed the diary. He held it for a moment, thinking. Then he slipped it into the inside pocket of his work vest, zipped it shut, and stood up. He pressed the button for the service elevator. The doors opened. He stepped inside. He was going to the 32nd floor. He was going to fix a jammed panel and stay out of the way and do his job. That was the plan. But he did not yet know that in his chest pocket, pressed against his ribs, was the one thing that could bring the entire proceeding upstairs to a complete and immediate stop. The elevator began to rise. The 32nd floor was a different world. Anthony had been up here before, twice, maybe 3 times, always for something mechanical, always brief. The carpet was thicker than the floors below. The air smelled different, cleaner somehow, as if even the ventilation system had been designed to remind you where you were. The hallway outside the main conference suite was wide and hushed, lined with frosted glass panels that let light through without letting eyes through. Important work happened behind glass like that, the kind of work that required both visibility and privacy at the same time. He found the HVAC panel easily enough. It was set into the wall about 15 feet from the conference suite entrance. A gray metal housing, slightly ajar, the internal fan caught on something it shouldn't be. He opened his kit, crouched down, and began working. His hands moved through the familiar motions without needing instruction. Through the glass partition to his left, he could see the meeting. He was not trying to watch, but the partition was there, and the people inside it were visible the way things are visible when you are trying to look somewhere else and cannot quite manage it. Rice stood at the far end of the table, composed, unhurried, a man conducting a meeting the way a conductor leads an orchestra he has already rehearsed to obedience. Board members sat in a row, lawyers lined the back wall, documents passed from hand to hand. Anthony looked away and focused on the panel. That was when he noticed the woman. She was sitting on a bench in the small waiting area just outside the conference suite entrance. Not inside, not invited in, placed out here the way you place something you are not sure what to do with yet. Mid-40s, dark coat, posture so straight it looked like a decision she had made a long time ago and kept renewing. She was not looking at her phone. She was not reading anything. She was simply sitting, very still, with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the middle distance in the particular way of a person who is concentrating very hard on staying calm. A firm attorney stood beside her, speaking in a low voice. Anthony caught fragments while he worked. Without documentation of your father's original intent. There is nothing to contest. The board's decision, once ratified, will... I understand this is difficult, Ms. Roberts. The woman said nothing. She looked down at her hands. Something shifted in her jaw some. Tightened slightly, the way a person tightens when they have decided not to say the thing they are most feeling. Then she folded her hands more deliberately in her lap and went still again. Anthony closed the panel. The fan inside it hummed back to life, quiet and even. He gathered his tools slowly. Ms. Roberts. Her father's original intent, no documentation. He looked at the diary in his vest pocket, the slight rectangular bulk of it pressing against his ribs. He had been carrying it all morning. He had intended every hour of that morning to give it to the right person. But he had simply not been able to locate anyone willing to be that person. He decided to try once more. He went back downstairs and approached the front desk a second time. Alicia was still overwhelmed, still typing, still not quite looking at him. He explained the situation as clearly as he could, the initials on the cover, the portrait on the wall, the woman upstairs who was asking about her father's documents. Alicia told him, not unkindly, that she could not redirect lost property to individuals without a formal process. She slid a form across the desk. He could submit a written description of the item. Someone would follow up within 5 to 7 business days. He folded the form and put it in his pocket. Then he called his supervisor. His supervisor told him to leave the item at reception and return to his assigned floor. And he asked if there was someone in the legal department he could speak to directly. He was told to submit a written request through the building's internal system. Response time was typically 3 to 5 business days. He stood in the lobby with the diary in his vest and the fan of closed doors arranged neatly in front of him. Each one polite, each one final. And understood, not for the first time in his life, that a system's efficiency and its fairness are not the same thing. He was still standing there when Rice appeared. He had not heard him coming. Rice moved the way powerful men sometimes move in buildings they own, without announcing himself, without hurry, with the quiet confidence of someone who has already calculated the outcome of every room before entering it. He was not a tall man. He did not need to be. He stopped in front of Anthony at a distance that was professionally appropriate and said, without raising his voice or changing his expression, "Mr. Zamora." Anthony said nothing. He waited. "I understand you found something this morning." Rice's tone was the temperature of a room with no windows. Not cold exactly, but without warmth. "Something belonging to the firm. I'd like to take that off your hands." "I was trying to return it," Anthony said, through the right channels." "This is the right channel," Rice said simply. He held out his hand. Anthony looked at the hand. He looked at Rice. He thought about Maria's lunchbox on the counter. He thought about the rent. He thought about the 5 years he had spent inside this building doing exactly what was asked of him, carefully and without complaint. "The diary contains documents," Anthony said. I think they may be relevant to—" "The diary is firm property," Rice said, with a patience that had a floor to it. "And the proceedings upstairs are not your area of concern. You maintain the building." He paused just briefly. "Let us maintain the business." Anthony's hand moved toward his pocket, almost involuntarily so, the way a muscle responds to training so deep it has become instinct. Comply, diminish, survive. His fingers touched the outer edge of the vest, and then Rice spoke again. "People like you," he said, his voice still level, still without drama, "don't make decisions like this." Anthony's hand stopped. He stood there for one long, quiet moment. He looked at Rice, at the certainty in his face. The rehearsed reasonableness of a man who had never once considered that this conversation might not go the way he intended. Anthony recognized the sentence. He had heard it before, not in those exact words, but in that exact shape. In a credentialing office, in a licensing form, in the careful language of rejection letters that apologized for nothing while closing every door. He had heard it so many times it had begun to sound like the truth. It did not sound like the truth today. He took his hand out of his pocket. "Empty. Thank you," he said quietly. "I'll be getting back to my floor." He turned and walked to the service elevator without looking back. He pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. He stood in the small metal box as it descended and looked at the floor and breathed. The diary was still in his vest. His heart was steady. His jaw was set in the particular way of a man who has just made a decision that will cost him something and has chosen to make it anyway. He did not know as the elevator descended that the vote had been pushed. Upstairs, a woman named Nancy Powell, a senior partner who had sat quietly through most of the morning's proceedings, had raised a procedural objection in the final minutes before ratification. The motion required a response before the vote could be finalized. Rice had handled it smoothly, efficiently, and with visible irritation. The vote was postponed to 9 o'clock the following morning. Anthony did not know any of this. He only knew that he had one evening and a diary that he had not yet read to the end. He had not yet seen the last page. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. And he walked out into the marble and the light and the sound of the fountain no one ever looked at, and he kept walking until he was outside and the city was around him and the building rose behind him into the sky. He had one night. He intended to use it. Maria fell asleep the way she always did, completely, without warning, mid-sentence about something that had happened at school. One moment she was talking and the next she was gone, her cheek pressed against the couch cushion, her breathing slow and even. Anthony carried her to her room, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her the way parents look at sleeping children, as if the stillness of them is a small miracle that might not last. Then he went to the kitchen table and sat down with the diary. The apartment was quiet. The city outside the window made its usual low sounds. A car, a distant voice, the particular hum of a neighborhood that never goes fully silent. Anthony made a cup of tea he did not drink and opened the diary to where he had left off. He read slowly. He had always been a slow reader of things that mattered. Stephen Roberts had written the way he designed, nothing wasted, everything considered. The early entries were technical, measurements, material notes, the precise language of a man working through a problem with a pencil. But as the diary moved forward in time, something shifted. The entries became more personal, more searching. There were observations about the direction the firm was taking. Buildings growing taller, scopes growing larger, clients caring more about impressiveness than usefulness. Roberts had written, and in one entry, that a building which intimidates the people standing in front of it has already failed its first and most important test. Anthony read that line twice. He turned the pages carefully. The later entries had a different quality, slower, more deliberate, written by a man who seemed to know his time was becoming finite and was choosing his words accordingly. Roberts described projects he had wanted to pursue that were quietly redirected, proposals he had made that were tabled without discussion, a growing distance between the firm that bore his name and the principles he had built it on. He did not write about Rice directly. He did not need to. The shape of the frustration made the cause of it clear enough. The last dated entry was brief. 8 months before Stephen Roberts died. The handwriting was slightly uneven, as if written late at night or in discomfort or both. The greatest thing I ever designed was never built. I hope someone finishes it. That was all. Anthony stayed with that sentence for a long moment. Then he turned to the final page. He stopped breathing. It was a sketch. Freehand, done quickly, the lines slightly unsteady, but the hand of a man drawing from memory rather than measurement, recording something that lived in him rather than something he was working out for the first time. A low-rise building, courtyard at the center, open to the sky, modular units arranged around it in a shape that would catch the morning light on the east side and the afternoon light on the west. The lower floors were wider, more accessible. The windows were large and thoughtfully placed, not for grandeur, but for the people who would sit beside them. And Anthony knew this building. He knew it the way you know a face you have not seen in years but cannot forget, instantly, completely, from somewhere deeper than memory. He knew the courtyard. He knew the window placement. He knew the logic of the lower floors, the reason the units were arranged the way they were. The specific problem the design was trying to solve. He knew it because he had designed it himself. Not this version. His version was different in its details, different proportions, different materials adapted to a different site. But the idea underneath it was identical. The same question answered the same way by two different people who had never met in two different countries 7 years apart. He had drawn his version at a kitchen table not unlike this one, late at night, after a long shift. And in the first year after they had arrived and before the rejections had finished accumulating, he had submitted it to a local nonprofit housing organization that was looking for design proposals. They had thanked him and informed him that without recognized professional credentials, his submission could not be considered. He had folded the sketch and put it away. He had not looked at it since. He got up from the table now and went to the drawer where he kept Maria's school drawings. Her paintings, her gold-starred spelling tests, the things he could not throw away. Behind all of it, tucked flat against the back panel of the drawer, was a folded piece of paper. He took it out. He unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something that has been folded for a long time, and carried it back to the table. When he set it beside Stephen Roberts' sketch, he sat down and looked at both of them together. The proportions were not identical. The details were different. His were rougher, younger, drawn by a hand that was still learning to say what it meant. But the intention was the same. The values underneath the lines were the same. 2 architects, 2 countries, 2 entirely separate lives. And the same building arrived at independently from the same belief about what buildings were for. Anthony sat very still for a long time. He did not cry. He was not built for crying easily, and this moment was too large for tears anyway. It was too large for almost any response. He simply sat with it, the way you sit with something that is both a wound and a gift at the same time and does not yet know which one it will finish being. Then he picked up his phone. It took him 40 minutes to find the number. He went through the firm's website, a professional directory, an archived article from an architectural journal that mentioned her by name. When he finally found a contact number listed under a preservation trust she was associated with, he sat with the phone in his hand for another 10 minutes before he pressed call. It rang 4 times. He was preparing himself for voicemail. She answered. He spoke carefully, without drama, the way he did everything. "My name is Anthony Zamora. I work maintenance at Roberts and Lamb. I found something this morning that belongs to your father. I think you need to see it before tomorrow morning." Silence. The particular kind of silence that means someone is deciding something. And then, "How did you get this number?" Anthony looked at the 2 sketches on the table, his and Stephen Roberts's side by side in the kitchen light. "The same way your father designed that building," he said. "I refuse to believe the door wasn't there." Another silence. Longer this time. "Come to the building at 8 o'clock, Alicia Roberts said. "I'll meet you in the lobby." The line went quiet. Anthony set the phone down on the table. He did not know that earlier that evening, Rice had called Alicia and told her, in his calm and efficient way, that a diary had been located, that it was being handled through the appropriate channels, and that there was no need for her to involve herself further. He did not know that Rice had described Anthony as a maintenance worker who had been dealt with. What he did not know that when the unknown number had appeared on Alicia's phone at 11 o'clock at night, she had looked at it for a long moment before answering. She had almost let it ring out. She had answered on the 4th ring. Anthony folded his sketch carefully and set it on top of the diary. He would bring both in the morning. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 11:23. He had just over 8 hours. He turned off the kitchen light and sat in the dark for a little while, thinking about a building that had never been built, and the man who had hoped someone would finish it. Outside, the city hummed its low and steady hum. Inside the maintenance locker on the 6th floor of the building across town, a work vest hung on a hook, now empty. The diary was here, at this table, in these hands. And tomorrow morning, everything would either change or it would not. Anthony had done the thing he could do. Now he would sleep, and in the morning he would go in through the front entrance for the first time in 5 years and see what the day decided to make of him. He stood in front of his closet for a long time that morning. He owned 2 sets of good clothes, a dark button-down he had bought for his wife's memorial, a gray jacket that no longer fit quite the way it once did. He looked at them for a while, his hand on the closet door, thinking. Then he closed the door and put on his work clothes instead. The familiar uniform, the plain fabric, the boots that knew every floor of that building. He was not going to pretend to be someone he was not. He had spent enough years doing that in reverse, pretending to be smaller. He was done with pretending in either direction. He made Maria's lunch. He drew a small lighthouse on the paper square and tucked it in beside her apple slices. He kissed her forehead. He picked up the diary and his own folded sketch from the kitchen table and walked out into the early morning. Alicia Roberts was already in the lobby when he arrived. She was standing near the fountain, the one no one ever looked at, with her coat still on and a coffee cup in her hand that appeared to be untouched. She looked like someone who had not slept, which Anthony suspected was true, and like someone who had decided that was not going to matter today, which he was certain was also true. She watched him cross the lobby toward her with an expression he could not immediately read. Not suspicion, not warmth either. Something more careful than both. He handed her the diary without a word. She opened it standing up right there beside the fountain and read the way people read when they are not performing the act of reading but actually doing it. Her eyes moving quickly, her body very still, one hand holding the diary and the other wrapped around the coffee cup she had stopped thinking about. She turned pages. She slowed as she reached the later entries. She stopped entirely at the last dated one, and Anthony watched something move through her face. A ripple, quickly controlled, the grief of a daughter recognizing her father's handwriting in a sentence he had written when he knew he was running out of time. Then she reached the final page. She looked up at Anthony. He reached into his jacket and unfolded his own sketch and held it out to her. She took it. But she looked at it and then at the diary and then back at it again. She did this 3 times. She did not ask him to explain. She did not need him to. "Come back at 9, she said. Her voice was steady. "Wait in the lobby." He did. He sat in one of the chairs near the entrance and waited while the building filled around him. Employees arriving, elevators opening and closing, the day organizing itself into urgency. At 8:58, he watched Alicia step into the executive elevator with the diary under her arm and his sketch folded in her coat pocket. The doors closed. At 9:14, a lawyer he did not recognize came out of the stairwell door. walked directly to him and said, "Mr. Zamora, they're asking for you." Anthony stood up. He walked to the executive elevator. He pressed the button and rode it to the 32nd floor and stepped out into the thick carpet and the clean air and walked toward the conference suite. The lawyer opened the door for him. He went in. The room went still, not loudly. There was no gasp, no dramatic pause in conversation. It went still the way rooms go still when something enters that does not fit the category of things the room was prepared for. 7 board members, 3 senior partners, lawyers along the wall, every pair of eyes turning toward the door, toward the maintenance uniform, toward the man standing inside it with his hands at his sides and his jaw set the way it had been set since the service elevator the day before. Rice was at the head of the table. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, just slightly, just once, in this way of a man who has run a calculation and arrived at an answer he did not expect. Alicia stood near the window. The diary was on the table in front of her. 3 board members were already leaning over documents, quietly conferring. One of the lawyers had stepped away from the wall and was speaking in a low voice into his phone. Alicia presented the diary's contents methodically and without emotion. The original blueprints, the handwritten design notes, the documented history of a structural system that had been claimed in Rice's legal filings to have no original source. The board members listened, they asked questions. They compared the diary's pages to the patent documents already on the table. The questions got quieter and more precise. Which is what questions do when a case is collapsing and everyone in the room can feel it, but no one has said so yet. Rice said very little. He had the look of a man who had prepared for a storm that was arriving from the wrong direction. Then Alicia picked up the diary and read aloud from the last dated entry. The room listened. The sentence hung in the air when she finished. "The greatest thing I ever designed was never built. I hope someone finishes it." With the particular weight of a dead man's words read in a room full of people who were supposed to be honoring what he built. Alicia set the diary down. She looked at Anthony. "Mr. Zamora," she said, "what do you see in these blueprints?" The room waited. Anthony looked at the blueprint on the table. He looked at it the way he had always looked at buildings. Not at the surface of it, but through it, into the thinking underneath, the decisions made at every junction, the values encoded in every line. Then he looked up at the room, at the board members and the lawyers and the senior partners and Rice, who was still watching him with that controlled and recalculating expression. And the architect in Anthony Zamora, who had been quiet for a very long time, spoke. He talked about the courtyard at the center and why it was placed there, not for aesthetics, but for community, so that the building's residents would have a reason to see each other. He talked about the window placement and what it said about whose comfort the designer had prioritized. He talked about the lower floors, their width, their accessibility, the deliberate choice to make the building's most welcoming spaces closest to the street, closest to the people least likely to be welcomed into most buildings. He talked about what the structural system in those blueprints had been designed to do and why it was significant and what it would mean for the kind of work the firm could pursue if it chose to pursue it. He spoke for perhaps 4 minutes, maybe 5. He was not aware of the time. He was aware only of the blueprint and the things it was saying and his own voice saying them clearly in a room that had decided, without discussing it, not to interrupt. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Nancy Powell removed her glasses and set them on the table. She looked at Anthony for a long moment without speaking. At the back of the room, a junior board member who had barely spoken all morning was writing something in her notepad with focused attention. Rice said nothing. The merger did not survive the morning. By the end of the week, Rice had submitted his resignation. The terms were quiet, the settlement sealed, and no one in the building discussed it openly, though everyone knew. Alicia and Nancy Powell began the work of rebuilding the firm along the principles its founder had intended. Smaller projects, community-centered, buildings that measured their success by what happened inside them rather than how tall they stood. They called Anthony into a meeting 3 weeks later and explained a new position they wanted to create: Community Design Liaison, a bridge between the firm's technical capabilities and the neighborhoods it built for. They described it carefully, as if they were not certain he would accept. He listened, then he said, "I'll take it, but I have one condition." They waited. "I want my credentials formally evaluated," he said. "My degree, my prior work. I want it assessed through the proper process, and I want it on record." They arranged it. His degree was reviewed by an independent board. His prize-winning work was examined alongside his current knowledge. His credentials held, not as a courtesy, not as a gesture, but as a finding. He was not given something. He was recognized for something he had always had. He still nodded to the security guard every morning. He still noticed things about the building that no one else flagged. He filed the report about the lobby column the first week in his new role. A structural team was sent to assess it within the day. Years passed the way years do. Not quickly, not slowly, but steadily, the way well-built things are meant to last. The morning came when Anthony sat in the third row of a university architecture studio and watched his daughter stand in front of her first formal critique. Maria had her mother's posture and her father's eyes, the kind that looked at a thing and saw all the way through it. She presented her work with clarity and precision and the specific confidence of someone who had been taught without being directly told that the size of your paycheck has nothing to do with the size of your understanding. At the end, her professor asked the room a question he always asked at first critiques. Who had inspired them to pursue architecture? Maria smiled. It was her mother's smile, wide, complete, too generous to be contained. My father," she said. "He built things his whole life. It just took a while for anyone to notice." Anthony looked at his hands for a moment, then he looked up at his daughter standing at the front of the room, and he let himself feel the full weight of everything it had taken to get to this chair, in this row, in this building, watching this. Somewhere tonight, there is a person in the wrong uniform carrying the right answer. They are moving quietly through a building that does not yet know what it has. They are doing their work with precision and dignity and a private knowledge that the world around them has not thought to ask about. The question was never whether they had it. The question is whether we are willing to be still enough and humble enough and brave enough to listen when they speak. Don't walk past the ones who hold the building up. They may be the only ones who truly understand how it was built to stand.